A warm welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Barbara Valotskova, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization. Center on Asia and Globalization is a research center here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It conducts in-depth research on developments in the Asia-Pacific and beyond, and it aims to provide decision makers, academics, and the general public with objective analysis on issues of regional and global significance. Today's panel session is part of our Counterpoint Southeast Asia webinar and policy brief series that aims to answer major questions of strategic significance for Southeast Asia, and bring together diverse voices from around the region. So each issue aims to answer one major question from 3 or 4 different perspectives. And as you all know, today's question we'll aim to answer is what are the implications of the 2024 US presidential election on Southeast Asia? And with that, I give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Dennis Hu, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So good afternoon, or coming towards evening to all of you. So my name is Dennis Hu. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Center of Asia and Globalization. I think when we prepared this this seminar, it was about 2-3 months ago. So at that time, we thought it's going to be a tight race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. But we now know it wasn't a tight race. It was quite a decisive win by Donald Trump. So he's going to be sworn in sometime in January 2025. So we are looking at over the next 4 years a second Trump administration, which is some people calls it Trump 2.0. So what is the implications for this region, for Southeast Asia? I used to work in APEC for 12 years in the policy support unit. So I've lived through Trump 1.0, and we could see the trade war between US and China started during that period of time. We saw rising trade protectionism and the concept of free and fair trade. Now, fair trade is subject to interpretation depending on whether it's the US or other countries, right? So what are the implications for Southeast Asia? I think that's the big question. What are the challenges that over the next 4 years? And perhaps there might be some potential opportunities as well. So to answer this question, we have 3 plus me speakers to talk about this. We are experts coming from universities and think tanks. So I'll do a quick introduction to our speakers. The format is that I'll ask each one of them, including myself, to just speak for not more than 10 minutes. We just state our arguments and our points from our perspectives, and then I'll open it up to floor. So feel free to ask any questions that you'd like to any of us, right? So let me do a quick introduction. I won't go into the details of their biodata. It's on the website. So our first speaker will be Mr. Edsel John Ibarra. He is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Philippines, Diliman. Our second speaker will be Mr. Muhammad Habib, who's he's a researcher at the Department of International Relations at the Jakarta-based Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS. Some of you may know that. And our third speaker is Ms. Huang Tiha. She's a senior fellow and coordinator at the Regional Strategic and Political Studies program at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, ISIS Yusof Isha Institute, one of the oldest, for many of you are Singapore, one of the oldest research institutes focusing on Southeast Asian studies. And then there's me, and I'll talk about more about the economic implications. So that's it. So each speaker, 10 minutes each, state your points. So we'll start with Edsel, you first.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming here. So in a repeat of 2017, we're all bracing for another Trump presidency. But I'm here to offer the boring take, as Dr. Dennis mentioned, that while there are risks, there are also opportunities. But the mix is going to differ depending on for whom you're asking the Trump administration will be. Another Trump presidency is probably going to be bad for the US domestically because of their values of multiculturalism, liberal democracy, etc. But for others, it could go either way. It's mixed for the international system, I think, and for the region. But for the Philippines, I think there are more good news than bad news. I'm here to tell you why I think that. But before going there, let me view it from the international system first and then the regional level. For the international system, Trump is unpredictable, but not completely unpredictable, right? We know what he dislikes. So he dislikes open borders, free trade, multilateralism, principled stances in negotiations. He dislikes free riders, and he dislikes American interventionism. The flip side is that he likes border controls, protectionism, bilateralism, transactionalism, those who pay, and limited intervention by America. For the international system, some of those things are, I believe, could give us some cause for optimism. I won't detail the risks as much because we know probably what the risks are, such as risks for globalization, for the rules-based economic order, and for international institution building. We know those risks already. But I think because of Trump's transactionalism and openness to negotiate with non-democratic leaders, I expect that he could bring about international stability if he is able to make deals on peaceful coexistence with US adversaries. Now, it's a negative peace thing in that peace in the sense that there is not going to be war, and it's not positive peace in the sense of peace envisioned by those who support democracy promotion and building the foundations for peace in conflict zones. But it's peace nonetheless, I suppose. No? For another, because Trump may pull out the US from international commitments, other great powers, middle powers, and regional organizations such as ASEAN are now afforded space to offer leadership where the US retreats. If the US takes on leadership too much, sometimes there's no voice in the room for the others. Now that the US is going to tone itself down, perhaps there is now space for the others to take up leadership. If the US does back down and other countries do step up, we might see a transition to true multipolarity, which is probably preferable to a unipolar or unstable bipolar order. For Southeast Asia, I also see some causes for optimism. Of course, Trump's preference for bilateralism is bad for ASEAN centrality because US is now not going to deal with ASEAN as a region, but two individual countries. But ASEAN centrality, if extending my argument earlier, if ASEAN steps up from the void that a US retreat would make, it could probably strengthen ASEAN centrality if ASEAN takes on the opportunity. Now, for the Philippines, I'm a bit more optimistic. The reason for my optimism is that during the first Trump administration, we had a lot of security guarantees on the South China Sea and military support from the United States. We never got that under the Obama administration. So for the Philippines, there's a perception that Trump implemented the pivot to Asia better than the previous administration, did more to the Philippines in 4 years than Obama did in 8 years. For the main reasons why we think that is that, for one, the United States declared that the South China Sea is covered by the Mutual Defense Treaty by the Philippines and the United States. We sought that declaration since the Obama administration. We never got that under Obama. They also said that paramilitary attacks, including by Chinese maritime militia vessels, are considered to fall under the Mutual Defense Treaty. They also, in a flip to the US traditional position of neutrality on the territorial and maritime disputes in the South China Sea, they explicitly sided with the Philippines' maritime claims. They remain silent on the territorial issues, but on the maritime claims, the US sided strongly in favor of the Philippines and endorsed explicitly the South China Sea Arbitration Award, which was a big thing for Filipino policymakers. The Trump administration also undertook more freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea in 4 years than Obama did in 8. For the first time ever, the United States imposed economic and visa restrictions against Chinese companies and nationals involved in reclamation and militarization in the South China Sea. So for Filipino policymakers, Trump did so much, assured the Philippines so much that if you listen to the current mood by current administration officials, they're saying that there's no reason to worry about the second Trump administration. There are some hypothetical worries out there, such as that the United States might pull out the $500 million aid package, the military aid package that the Biden administration pledged to the Philippines. I don't think they will pull that out. For one, because the $500 million bill is a one-time payment. And if you compare it to recurring payments the US makes on its bases in Japan and South Korea, it makes only 1% of the I think the figure is 34 billion US dollars that the United States pays annually to them. No, and contrary to what some are saying, there are no permanent US bases in the Philippines. There are simply US facilities. Bases is a very strong word if you try to visit some of those facilities. They cannot support permanent military presence by the United States. So the cost of maintaining them are very minimal. And so from a transactionalist perspective, I think Trump might be persuaded that it's cheaper to continue paying the Philippines this way, rather than the permanent bases that they have in Japan and South Korea. For another, the US allies are unlikely to bandwagon with China. We did try to bandwagon with China because, not because of Trump, but because we had our own Trump in the person of Rodrigo Duterte. But there are worries that because the US might reduce its presence, the US is not any more credible in the region, states in the region might bandwagon with China instead. We didn't see that happening with US allies. In fact, what we saw is that spoke-to-spoke cooperation, so cooperation among US allies in Asia, strengthened. And so now, because of developments in the security domain, we have now strategic partnerships. The Philippines has strategic partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. So, these countries have also increased their military assistance to the Philippines. So, in fact, the Philippines is the first recipient of Japan's first official security aid or assistance. And so, really, the allies seem to have stepped up because of the void that the United States left in Southeast Asia. So we expect the same to continue. And in any case, the institutions are already there. So the strategic partnerships agreement have already been signed. It's all there. So we expect that it's just going to snowball. But there are real worries. Trump may be lured to accept a deal with China that involves a reduction of US presence and US support to the Indo-Pacific. I don't know how China might be able to come up with that deal. Perhaps if China makes some major economic concessions, then Trump may be lured to accept such a deal. But we must wait and see if that happens. It's a real worry. The other is that Trump will probably abandon the Indo-Pacific economic framework of the Biden administration, and he's probably going to fixate on military balancing. So the military aspect is probably going to be highlighted. So the US support in through non-military means might probably go down, and so that's one of the worries that the Philippine side is having. So those are my I don't know if I'm delusional, but some points for optimism coming ahead.
No, I don't think you're delusional, but you've given a very sort of optimistic, positive tone to what we might expect for over the next 4 years, and who knows, particularly on maritime security, right, and over the South China Seas. So, so our next speaker is Habib, and to make his presentation, Habib. Yeah.
Check, check, check. Thank you, Dennis. I'd like to begin my speech by thanking Dennis, Barbara, Selena, and also colleagues at NUS and Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for the invitation. It's really my honor to speak here and also to talk about the perspective of an Indonesian. I'm not going to represent the whole country, but at least I represent myself as an Indonesian. So before I come to my point, let me say something about Indonesia-US relations. I guess Indonesia is pessimistic about the US election outcome, but we manage our own expectations. We are not a US ally. We are not a treaty ally of the US. We are not a free trade agreement of the United States. So we understand that there are certain ceilings that Indonesia as a non-aligned country can get and cannot get from the United States. So let me begin the first point about Indonesia's expectation from the United States. Actually, there are 4 expectations of Indonesia towards the United States. First thing first is Indonesia expects the United States to actually continue to play the leading role and also defend the rules-based order, especially at the economic arena. We understand, thanks to the liberal international order, Indonesia's economy can recover from the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and since then, Indonesia is still, a country with the largest voting shares at the Bretton Woods institution compared to other Southeast Asian countries, the World Bank and also like the IMF, and even like we were being sued by the by the European Union at the World Trade Organization over Indonesia's nickel ore export ban in 2020. We appeal to the appellate body, despite knowing that the appellate body wouldn't function, but we still appeal because we have belief and we have faith in the system. And then that's the first point. And then the second point is, of course, like other developing countries, we want to secure more investment from the United States, supplementing what we already have from China. Of course, we talk about the elevation of Indonesia-US diplomatic status last year from the comprehensive partnership into comprehensive strategic partnership. That's one of the ways we try to get more investment from the United States. And probably you heard also Indonesia is interested to become an OECD member. Thus, we also do a lot of domestic reform with the eye of gathering more investment come to Indonesia. And then the third one is, of course, not only we want to gain more market access at the United States, but we also want our export products have a competitive price in the United States. And that's why probably you heard Indonesia during the first Trump presidency or during the first Trump administration, we fought so hard to maintain our generalized system preference, despite, Trump initiated review about Indonesia's GSP status. But thanks to the effort by the former Indonesian administration, we managed to keep it that way. And then also, we are now, pushing the United States to also have like critical mineral agreement over Indonesia's nickel exports. So the vision was. The vision is, securing more market access like the one that US has with Japan. But I know that the negotiation is still delayed because of the election process in the US. And then the fourth one is definitely Indonesia's interest or Indonesia's expectation towards the United States is, to provide international assistance so that Indonesia's economy can competitive or can be resilient against 21st century challenges like climate change, among others. That's why Indonesia has participated in the US Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and also like the JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership. And also we were offered by the United States to join Mineral Security Partnership and also like the Innovation and Technology Science Fund. So those are Indonesia's expectations towards the United States. But we understand that because Trump is now the president-elect and also will take office in the next several months. So we understand there might be changes over these expectations and also like over the office by the US. And then what we expect is definitely the first one is I guess Edsel already mentioned about, and also Dennis mentioned about transactionalism, right? So for Indonesia, I guess as long as we hit the right note, we try to convince the US about what we want, and then what would be, for them, as for Trump, with regards to cooperating with Indonesia, probably we will get it. But, we also understand that there is this China factor that has changed so much, like from the first Trump administration, right? So before, I guess like the idea was about targeting China as a country of origin and allowing friendly countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand to reap the benefit of friendshoring. But not so much today, because we heard, and even like Biden also continued like the approach, hostility towards China, and then shifting from the country of origin to company of origin. We know what happens with, for example, the US Inflation Reduction Act, right? It doesn't necessarily target China per se, but also Chinese companies operating abroad, operating overseas, including Indonesia. Indonesia suffered from this provision because Indonesia's nickel supply chain is, probably you also understand that the domination of Chinese companies in Indonesia's nickel supply chain. Thus, Indonesia cannot reap the benefit of this clean vehicle credit that is provided under the US IRA. And then also, we see the widening trade deficit between US and also Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, except Singapore. I guess Singapore maintains, trading with Singapore for the US, maintaining surplus. But with Indonesia, we also, I guess like the US recorded the trade deficit. Other than that, I guess there are certain, points that, or like blessing in disguise for Indonesia. For example, personal relationship matters for Trump. Of course, we know that the private sectors to private sectors under Trump presidency, and also with Indonesia's private sectors thriving. And I guess one Indonesian businessman has a strong connection with Trump, and also Trump has businesses in Indonesia. To some extent, what I personally see is President Trump admires a strong leadership, and we are grateful President Prabowo at the moment has that kind of persona or charisma, although with certain limitations, we understand about that. But again, I guess we need to manage our own expectation, and this is my last point, or my last section. Reflection for Southeast Asian countries from the way Indonesia is doing and from the way Indonesia is trying to navigate the second Trump administration. First thing first, we understand that we cannot rely only on the US. We need to diversify, not to diversify to developing countries, but to diversify to other industrialized nations like non-US G7 members. For example, Canada, European Union, Japan, and also like the UK. I guess with EU and also Canada, Indonesia is trying to conclude the comprehensive economic partnership so far. And also we are trying to expedite our accession to CPTPP. That's the way Indonesia is trying to navigate our reliance or dependency towards the US only. So we look at other industrialized nations. That also to attract more investment, not only from the US, but also from developed markets. And second, definitely this is happening with regards to some officials already thinking and already working on it to create two different supply chains, especially with regards to Indonesia's critical minerals. So we understand there is need to address, the compliance requirement about the ESG compliance requirement from the developed markets. That's why I guess we try to set up a different supply chain for that. We understand it's going to be costly, but that's the price we have to pay under this kind of circumstances. But the other, the other supply chain is targeted to developing countries that cares more about the affordability element of it, or the affordability aspect of it, and we can still work with China to answer developing countries market. But with developed markets, it's more about working with other partners such as South Korea. We understand that South Korea has the brand, has the technology, and also has the experience. So that's the way we try to answer these two different supply chains. And we are also, the third one is investing, we are thinking about, this has been overlooked by the former administrations in Indonesia, but under the new administration, probably we are going to do it, revitalizing our relationship with the Congress. We know how important the Congress towards US policy. That's why this year we reinvigorate or revitalize a Friends of Indonesia caucus in the US Congress, in hoping that US Congress will also see Indonesia as a valuable partner to them. And then this is my last point, as I promised. Indonesia is undertaking domestic reform. Domestic reform, not only to as a full requirement for joining the OECD, but also because we think it is necessary for Indonesia to leapfrog our economy in realizing our golden vision. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Habib. It's an interesting take, and we also, don't forget that Indonesia has also a new administration with President Prabowo. My feeling is that most likely the US will see Indonesia as very strategic, strategic within ASEAN, a strategic country, partly because of critical minerals. It's also a member, it's the only ASEAN member of G20, right? So our third speaker is Ha, and I think it's interesting to note that Vietnam is one of the major beneficiaries of the China Plus One strategy in terms of over the last 4 or 5 years. And we had a discussion about looking at trade deficits, right? So the US has, and I think number 1 is of course China, but number 2 is Mexico, number 3 is EU, and number 4 is Vietnam. So that's something to also take note. Ha, over to you.
Thank you. You mentioned Vietnam in your introduction, but my presentation would start with the overall regional context first, and of course I will discuss Vietnam as well as some examples, some very, very stark examples. I would like to start by setting certain context first for us to try to make sense of what Trump 2.0 would mean for the region. The first thing is that there is a sense of deja vu because we already have Trump 1.0 for us as a preview. But at the same time, of course, there remains a lot of unpredictability and anxiety because Trump, with his decisive victory, with what he calls the unprecedented powerful mandate from the American people, and with the Republican majority in both chambers of the House, of the Senate, of the Congress, I think it would be a much more emboldened and much less restrained, both in terms of policy and personnel. The second in the context is that Trump's election in 2016 has signaled a changed America and a changed views within the American elites about its relationship with the world. And this is something that both the Republican and the Democrats have internalized and have recapitulated in their own ways over the past 8 years. Trumpism may be the most radical form of a changed America, but I think this structural change transcends Trump himself. And what is the change in terms of the U.S. engagement with the world? I think it signals the desire from many Americans to pivot away from the global leadership, or what we call the liberal internationalism that has primarily defined American policy since after the Second World War. And instead, there is a shift towards self-privatization, self-care, and a greater skepticism from global entanglements, be it about war or aid or even regime change missions overseas. And as we can have seen from the past 4 years of the Biden administration's foreign policy, even though it is, of course, more conventional, more restrained, and more polite, and more predictable than Trump, but I think the Biden administration has also already recapitulated the American foreign policy by reconciling the liberal internationalist tradition with a more pragmatic focus on the narrowly defined American interests and a greater willingness to go unilateral if necessary, especially as we can see very clearly in the domain of the US international economic policy making. And The third part of the context is that as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, actually dealing with the periodic uncertainties of the US foreign policy, as well as the US presence and engagement in Asia and in Southeast Asia in particular, with the 4-year cycle of the US presidential election, is actually a structural element of our relations with the US over many, many decades. The nature of the shocks or of the disruptions with each coming US administration may be different, but the ability to adapt, to adjust, and even to move on has been part of the Southeast Asian country's psyche and strategy when dealing with the US. The fourth part of the context is that Southeast Asia has never been, except for the short period of the Vietnam War during the Cold War, has never been a focus of the US foreign policy. And actually, this could be both a boon and a bane, but overall, it is a structural element as well. We always take a backseat behind the US priorities in other parts of the world where the US has bigger allies, bigger stakes, and wars as well, like in Europe, Middle East, and Northeast Asia. But regardless of the fact that we are almost always in the secondary theater, there are two factors that keep the US welcomed and engaged and welcomed in this region since the end of the Cold War. The first is globalization, which has enabled Southeast Asian countries to integrate deeply into the global supply chains that connect both China and the US and other major economies of the world. And the second is the shared interest of both the US and Southeast Asian countries, or I must say most Southeast Asian countries, in maintaining the US military presence in this region as an offshore balancer to provide certain support to regional stability. And these two consistent factors have kept the US engaged and welcomed in this region, regardless of who is in the White House. But it is exactly these two factors that will come under the greatest pressure and stress under Trump 2.0. And that has led me to highlight two biggest fears at the Southeast Asian level when it comes to Trump 2.0. The first one is about the economic development model that most Southeast Asian countries have relied on for economic prosperity in the past decades since the end of the Cold War has been the globalization model in which we are deeply integrated into the global supply chains with a lot of trade not only among ourselves but also with the rest of the world, and making the regions and individual countries be very attractive to foreign direct investments, so that we will. The fact is that we import a lot of intermediate goods from China for final exports to the US. And of course to Europe as well. And at the same time, Chinese exports to the US also draw upon certain commodities and intermediary goods from Southeast Asia as well. So our countries are very, very exposed to international trade, of course with different levels. Singapore is the country that has the highest trade to GDP ratio at more than 300, followed by Vietnam, 180 something. And after that, Malaysia and Thailand, 130. Indonesia may be the most insular, 41%. So maybe you will not be so concerned about that fact. But the thing is, Trump's threats to levy so unprecedented high tariffs on both China and on imports across the board, of course, will send a lot of shockwaves across the global supply chains and disrupt a lot of global trade and impair our economic growth. Some some banks have, or studies have indicated that if those tariffs are materialized, then it will shave off around 1% of our GDP growth, and that is a very big amount of economic loss. Here comes the case of Vietnam. In his first administration, Trump, when he paid attention to Vietnam, it was about also trade. And he said Vietnam is even worse than China as the country, as the currency manipulator. But after that, our government have found some way to appease him. Although we were still at the end of the Trump 1.0 administration in the currency manipulator list of the Trump administration. So, but since between 2017 to 23, Vietnam actually is among, arguably, I would argue that among the biggest beneficiaries of the Trump trade war against China. Our trade surplus with the US has tripled from 30-something billion dollars in 2017 to 90-something billion dollars in 2022. And our ASEAN trade surplus with the US overall is around $143 billion. And Vietnam accounts for almost 2/3 of it, 83 billion US dollars in 2023. So I'm sure that countries like Vietnam and below Vietnam, Thailand and Malaysia that run a lot of trade surplus with the US will come under intense scrutiny and pressure and even punitive measures from the Trump administration. I would like to highlight one point here about the vulnerabilities and the way forward. After Trump's re-election, many commentaries say that this is the opportunity for Southeast Asian countries to increase their internal economic integration and diversify their markets beyond beyond the US. And of course, that is a very logical way forward, but it is easier said than done. Intra-ASEAN trade has stayed at around 20 to 23% of the total ASEAN trade for the past 3 or 4 decades. And the thing is, it is intimately or intricately linked to Southeast Asian trade with the rest of the world. So how much we trade with each other depends on how much we trade with the rest of the world, especially major economies like the US, Europe, and China. So it is not that we can just easily diversify among ourselves and then diversify away from the US. And the second point is that we also hope that China can absorb more goods from Southeast Asia. And it has been an unfulfilled hope for many decades, despite the fact that we have tried to upgrade ASEAN-China free trade agreements for many times, not many times, 3 times. Twice. Because it's very simple, China has dominated almost from the low end to the high end of the global supply chains, especially in the manufacturing, and also because of the current state of the Chinese economy with very low domestic consumption. And now with more pressure from the Trump administration with restrictions on Chinese goods, then actually the fear is that China will dump even more goods to Southeast Asian countries, which is already happening in sectors like solar panels, steel, and textiles in Indonesia and other sundry goods. And it is also concerning because economic nationalism and protectionism is actually not an American thing or a European thing now. It is a global thing, and it is happening in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is a big case in point. So it is not that easy that we can suddenly diversify and liberalize among ourselves and become a role model for the US to follow suit. And the second fear is, of course, about the US-China relations, which will embrace a very rough ride ahead. We know that strategic competition with the U.S. approach to China from the shift from engagement to strategic competition actually started under the Trump 1.0 and stabilized, and with the Biden administration, although with a more targeted and systematic approach. And of course, the Biden administration is very different in the sense that it has invested a lot in building relationships with its allies and partners. So I think the most interesting in development to watch in the coming years is about the internal negotiation or reconciliation or infighting within the Trump administration about how to approach China, or what is the best approach to compete or confront or contain China. Because if we look at the names that Trump has picked for his cabinet members, and including J.D. Vance, and then Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, Pete Hegseth, John Ratcliffe, all of them are China hawks. But the thing is, these people's issues with Trump are very ideological and strategic. But Trump's issue with China, I don't think it is ideological or strategic, it is transactional. So to even like among the advisors and the advisors with Trump and how to reconcile a systematic approach towards China, a hardline approach China with Trump's tendency to make deals or to bargain or to say nice things when he meets Xi Jinping, we don't know. And also, I think at the greatest risk here in this region is the network of alliances and security partnerships that the Biden administration has spent a lot of efforts into building. And I think it could be arguably the biggest achievement of the Biden's foreign policy, at least in the Indo-Pacific region. And given Trump's skepticism towards alliances, that would be very uncertain for the future of this achievement under the Biden administration. I would end with two kinds of hopes because I don't think we are not without any agency actually. I believe that Southeast Asian countries, if there is something that we can describe in the most succinct way, is their foreign policy is also pragmatism. And I believe that Southeast Asian countries' pragmatism can meet Trump's pragmatism at some point. And I have seen it already in the case of Vietnam. For example, recently the Vietnamese Communist Party Secretary General To Lam, he visited the US, and there he witnessed the signing of a deal between a Vietnamese company and the Trump organization to build an 1.5 billion golf course and hotel complex in the province that is the hometown of our party chief as well. And of course, the Vietnamese government has been courting investments from SpaceX as well, the company of Elon Musk. And Elon Musk has been trying very hard to sell Starlink internet services to Vietnamese government, and the Vietnamese government has not been very committed. But I think this may be the time for them to earn some favors from these people. And another point is that our region is much more prepared, much more capable, much more connected and resilient this time. We have survived the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP by reinvigorating it through the CPTPP. We moved ahead with the RCEP, and now we are negotiating the first region-wide digital economic framework, DIFA. And I think the U.S., we don't need to wait for the U.S. to come to us, actually. Southeast Asian countries, because of its connectivity with all major economies in the world, as well as the internal dynamism among ourselves, I think the next 4 years would be tough. But of course, as with anything, this shall pass, and then we will emerge more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you, Ha. So one of the benefits of being the last speaker is everybody has said what I wanted to say, so I don't have to say very much. But I think one common thread that's come out from our speakers is the sense that ASEAN, the region, is more resilient. It's not just living through the trade war, but living through the pandemic as well. The economies here had to rebuild their economies. They're still doing that, but many of our economies in Southeast Asia has been stronger, and I think the question now is what do we do in the next 4 years in terms of diversifying some of our concerns on trade risks and others. I think on the trade front, we know that Trump has in doing his campaign, has talked about increasing tariffs for China's goods by 60%, and for the rest of the world, I think it ranges between 10 to 20%. Among all his campaign promises, I think certainly with China, I think he will do it. I think he will stick to his plans, particularly with China. And I think we know that there's been bipartisan support in seeing China as a strategic rival to the US, and that there's a sense that there's this sort of unfair trade practices so that is the general perception, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. So I think in that sense, I think that will happen. With the rest of the world, I think it will be a little bit more transactional, depending on which country and what I can get out of it. I think that we'll have to wait and see. There's a lot of doomsayers now. A lot of private sector economists have talked about, our global economy is going to slow down by, 1-2%. It's too early to tell, to be honest. We have to wait until he takes office to see what kind of increase in tariffs he's going to place. And to be honest, if you're an economist, there's also a toll on the domestic U.S. economy if he raises. It's inflationary by nature, right? So we'll have to wait and see. On global supply chains, I think Ha and a few of us have talked about how we're seeing this. Many ASEAN countries, Vietnam, not just Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, have benefited from the China plus one strategy, and that's not just because of the trade war. I think we know that because of the pandemic, the lockdowns. Many multinationals have begun to diversify their risks away from China, not solely dependent on a single supplier coming from China. So it's part of that diversification of risk that's happening. What's more worrying, of course, is this idea of onshoring, moving away a lot of your operations from the region, China, but also Southeast Asia, back to the US. So even during the Biden administration, there's been a lot of talk about de-risking, decoupling of supply chains, friendshoring, moving to places like Vietnam. But I think my concern is that because of the America First campaign, that he may force many multinationals, not just US multinationals, but Japanese and other multinationals to move more of their operations to the US. Now, from a trade economist point of view, that's not great. It creates a lot of trade diversion. You're sourcing now from less efficient suppliers. And of course, a lot of that onshoring that will happen, ultimately the American consumer will be the ones that will lose the most because labor cost is a lot higher. It defies our business logic of why we have global supply chains in the first place. Operational costs will go up. And American companies are the ones that are going to be paying for this increase in tariffs, right? And they're not going to just take it; they're going to pass it on to the end consumer. So in the end, it's the American end consumers that will have to face this. So I think that's one of the main concerns: is reconfiguration of supply chains, which might be a lot more onshore and moving back to the US rather than So you're seeing a shortening of these supply chains, and how that would distort trade, global trade. I think Ha and a few have talked about also the concerns about global fragmentation. Now, global fragmentation, particularly economic fragmentation, is essentially a reversal of globalization. And that's been happening for some time now, to be honest with you. It's not just because of the trade war, it's also because of this general dissatisfaction with this widening of income inequality globally that's been seen around the world. And I saw that too. I was still in APEC when Chile hosted APEC in 2019, and and they had to cancel the leaders' meeting in November because of demonstrations in Santiago. This rising cost of transport fees or something. It was just it was many things that led to that. So we're seeing this anti-globalization trend that's actually been rising, but the concern is that I think there will be another trade war between U.S. and China, and I think that will exacerbate this fragmentation of the global economy. And why is that so important? Because I think if some of you follow some of the reports by the IMF, geoeconomic fragmentation is bad. It creates fragmented markets. This bifurcation of the global economy between U.S. and China, that can be inflationary. Higher prices will affect technology, and ultimately will affect productivity, and actually will widen income inequality between member countries. So I think that's one of the concerns that we might be facing. Now, in terms of the U.S. engagement, yeah, I think some talked about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, right? But IPEF was kind of dying anyway. I don't know whether you follow IPEF, but there are 4 pillars, and they were able to conclude the 3 of them, but the 4th one, which is the most important on trade, those discussions broke down last year in November on the sidelines of the APEC meeting. So it's not surprising that most likely he's going to scrap IPEF. But what does that mean? I mean, it means there's less U.S. engagement in the Asia-Pacific and in the Southeast Asian region. And that's not great, right? I mean, it can leave a vacuum for China, for other economies. And this is where Southeast Asia needs to be more resilient. And we talked about it, right? We have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, one of the world's largest free trade, which is ASEAN-driven. There's a misconception that it's China-driven. It's an ASEAN-driven free trade agreement. That includes China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. It's one of the largest free trade agreements. It's 30% of global GDP. Something like, I don't know, I can't number here, something like $30 trillion US. All right, so it's a huge potential market for ASEAN, and its rules of origin is designed for supply chains. It's not a complex rules of origin, and it facilitates regional supply chains to expand and to grow in the region. So that's an opportunity there. And of course, we talked about diversifying. India was originally a partner of RCEP, but they backed out last minute towards the end. But India is always open to rejoin the trade agreement there. It's already been negotiated, so all India has to do is to come back, right? A bit like TPP as well, if the US wanted to rejoin. So there's a potential to look at new partners for ASEAN, including India, but also other emerging markets out there that are growing in Latin America as well. And I think by joining BRICS and other sorts of regional agreements, there's opportunities for new markets. And to be honest, ASEAN has economic clout. By 2030, if they're integrated, they're the 4th largest economy in the world. So it's a $4 trillion integrated market if they're integrated. And that's why it's very important for ASEAN itself to move step up on its regional economic integration, not just for its own regional economic security, but in a way to provide that buffer on the kind of economic environment, which we know is increasingly uncertain over the next couple of years and increasingly hostile. So we need to provide opportunities and to strengthen our economies through economic integration. So ASEAN itself is coming up with a new strategic plan for the ASEAN Economic Community that will be launched next year, and certainly our center and a few centers, including ISIS Singapore and others, CSIS, we've provided inputs to what we should be doing, what are the things that we should be looking at, some of the emerging challenges that ASEAN needs to face, like the digital economy, but also demographic trends. We have aging population in some countries and others are not. What we need to do in promoting innovation, productivity, these are all the challenges that ASEAN needs to be more resilient. And I think that's quite important if we move forward, right? So I think, so it's not all gloom and doom, and I think there's opportunities. And we've been through Trump 1.0, and I think we're a lot stronger now in Trump 2.0, and I think there's opportunities to move forward. So I'll stop here, and I think I'll open up the floor for any questions. I'll take a couple of questions first, and then please identify yourself and also let me know who you want to answer that question. Yes, please.
So my name is Shantanu. I'm a banker. My question is to Ha. I think she's articulated some of these things quite well in some ways. Two questions, actually, one, and maybe they're similar. And you also spoke about the resilience of the supply chains. My point is that the administration is well aware that the China plus one strategy has actually meant Chinese exports to a particular country, in intermediate exports, and then exports back into the US. And that's why there is so much of focus on what Mexico is doing. A similar kind of focus is likely to come on Vietnam, because that's, like you rightly mentioned, there's a lot of stuff which just comes from China, is packaged and sent out. That's true about a lot of other places. You know, there's a lot of talk about India doing iPhones and so on, but actually everything comes from China. And it's just packaged there and it's sent out. I think the administration's kind of getting, the people who've come into the administration have sort of figured that out. And therefore, how do you see that? Because there will, one of the things which is being talked about is that there would be graded tariffs. So you'd have a 60% tariff for China and 10% on everyone else. But if you see that it's a China pass-through, you might have a different tariff situation. So what's your read on that? The second is what we've spoken very succinctly, and we through policy measures, etc. Everybody has their own take, but the elephant in the room, to me, is chaos. And how do you deal with chaos?
Any disorder, chaos. Any other questions? We take a couple. Yeah, Andy. Yeah.
Hi, Andy Staples. So just going to the point there about ASEAN and its ability to step up. And I'm just wondering whether the sort of actions that we saw in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, acceleration of the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement and so on, to create a more homogenous market. Lots of problems that we know today, but still the intent was to create more of a regional economy. Is this the same opportunity to step up that type of integration, to A, resist the type of dumping that you were talking about from China, which is definitely in the pipe, and to create more internal resilience? And if you do think that there is the opportunity, what needs to happen to realise that?
Maybe you had a question here, which you want to take? If not, maybe you just answer. Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is related to the first question. I'm thinking about the possibility of actually scaling up this trade war and including Southeast Asia. From the point of view that, for instance, when you look at the trade surplus that Mexico has with the US, you look at that chart, and it's a mirror of the trade deficit that Mexico has with Asia, right? So, I think, like, to some extent, all of you were hopeful in terms of more pragmatism, maybe not with China, but yes, with the rest of the world. But what if, the new administration wants to tighten the screws, right, and actually be more aggressive?
One is on the China plus.
Thank you. Yeah, you are the economist, the only economist in the
that.
panel, so you will answer most of the questions. I just would like to talk about the Vietnam's case a little bit. As Denise said, Vietnam has benefited from the China plus one diversification strategy of the multinational companies, driven by the trade war, but also because of the Chinese economy moving up the supply chain with increasing wages in China, and of course with the COVID-19 pandemic as well. I'm not very concerned about the shortening of the supply chain in the short term. Currently, because of the trade war, actually China and the US do not trade as much directly, but they trade indirectly via Mexico and Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries. So it has been the lengthening of the supply chain. And there is the concern of the shortening, but I think it has been happening so far only in the very selective, targeted, strategic, high-tech industries, EVs or semiconductors, because the US cannot absorb that, the whole supply chains anyway, and the US labor is very expensive with all the regulation as well. And if Denise said that, Trump will impose 60% of tariff on the Chinese goods, but with us is maybe 10, maybe 5, even 20. There is still the gap there that, that can benefit Southeast Asia. And actually, the process of diversifying away from China has been accelerating, I think, and it will continue to accelerate because of the Trump 2.0 administration. The case of Vietnam is very interesting because we have a lot of exports to the US and trade surplus. We have benefited from it, but if you look at it critically, it has not done that much to improve our domestic manufacturing capabilities, because a lot of it, like trade and FDI in Southeast Asia, are very much intertwined. And they move to Vietnam as the location, but actually they import a lot of intermediary goods from China. And this is the opportunity, the pressure for Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam to really put pressure on multinational companies, but also to invest in our own resources, human capital, infrastructure, and everything, to make sure that we increase our own value add into the supply chains, and improve our own increase our participation in the supply chain. Otherwise, I think with the Trump administration, they will be very, very stringent on the rules of origin, and of course, we will suffer immensely. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the numbers exactly, but it's not entirely Chinese companies finding a loophole by moving their operations to Mexico or to Vietnam, because you have to remember that the global supply chains, particularly like electronic sector, semiconductors, it's very much, many of the Southeast Asian, including Malaysia, is very much part of that. That's linked to US companies as well as Chinese companies, depending on which part of the production chain they are, right? So this China plus one, which is what I mentioned, is not necessarily because Chinese companies have found a way out of these higher tariffs, but it's because multinationals do not want to have their entire operations, a large part of it, in China, in case you have another pandemic, which could happen, right? And you have another black swan event, and then you're trapped, right? And your supply chains get disrupted. So the point is that, and this is where Andy's point too is that, and a way to reduce chaos and uncertainty, I don't know how bad it's going to be, is that they really need to step up on integration. Because if you go back to the early documents of what the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community is, right? The idea is to create an integrated production platform, right? That could be an alternative to China in particular, right? And all these agreements, whether it's ASEAN Trade and Goods Agreement, the ASEAN Investment Agreement, they're all designed to facilitate greater intra-regional trade and investment among ASEAN companies as well, right? So if you can create a much more integrated platform that can be a sort of an attractive alternative to China, then that's what ASEAN is trying to do. That's one way to reduce that kind of uncertainty. But right now, we're not there yet, and I think we all know that. And even if you talk to Vietnam officials, like, I mean, you cannot absorb even a lot of what's moving out of China to Vietnam. You can't. It's just the sheer scale is not there, right? Industrial scale and capacity. But if we are able to coordinate among ourselves and to integrate those various production chains in ASEAN, then it's possible. But I think it's still some years to go to get to that stage. This is my personal view. I know how I used to work in the ASEAN Secretariat, but I was just recently there when they were talking about the next strategic plan. I see there's a lack of urgency. Maybe that's because this is before the elections. It seems like there's a lot of business as usual, and we've got all these agreements. We've done that. Everything you talk about, they've done it. There is an agreement, right? Digital economy. Yeah, we've got DIFA. Everything is there. But the big challenge for ASEAN is implementation. How do we get to how do we implement many of these regional agreements at the national level, right? So, which by right they should, because a lot of these agreements are legally binding, and they should be eventually translated into domestic laws and legislation and regulations. So the question is really about implementation. So they need to get a bit more serious. That sense of urgency is, hey, it's not the same as before. We can't do what we used to do for the last 20 years and everything's going to be great. I think there's a lot more challenges that's out there now that will have an impact on security. Barbara and I were doing a project on economic security, and ASEAN's approach to economic security is that, this idea of building stronger economic interdependence among member states, so that on the security side there won't be any more military conflict among member states, and that's worked quite well for ASEAN for many years. But also to see how we can strengthen that integration among member countries in the face of all these uncertainties, including Trump 2.0, right? Any more questions? If I not answer any, let me know. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm the ambassador of Belgium here. I have a question regarding to Singapore. You mentioned that Singapore has a trade, there is a trade surplus that is putting Singapore in a rather singular situation among the Asian.
It's the opposite. It's the only one that has the US.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So where does it leave Singapore in the connection of the member of ASEAN? There is also a very unique security dependency vis-à-vis the US. So I was wondering what would be the synergy among ASEAN members, and do you think that you are going to deploy a strategy where you will be speaking with one voice?
Okay. You want me to start first? I can just talk about the economic side. I think Singapore has always played a role as being kind of trying to lead by example, in terms of its, whether it's in terms of free trade, economic liberalization, financial liberalization, and many member states have tried to follow that example. So I think speaking with one voice is a challenge, I would have to admit. This idea of ASEAN centrality, ASEAN cohesiveness has been tested more on the security front than on the economic front. And certainly from the ASEAN's point of view, they don't, I don't know, I'm surprised nobody raised that question. They don't want to pick a side between US or China. Singapore or any other ASEAN members does not want to pick a side between US or China. Why? Because the US has got a long presence here, is in terms of foreign investments. And I'm a Malaysian. Intel has been in Penang for 50 years. And I'm from KL. When I was a kid, a million years ago, there was a Texas Instrument, used to make calculators. There's been a long U.S. presence in here. But we also know that our supply chains and our growth, economic growth potential is China, right? And our supply chains are linked also with China. So that potential for economic growth for the region, for ASEAN, is there. Now, my personal experience for Singapore's point is that that may have changed, but we work very well in the background. We are a model for the region, and many countries may not say it, but they follow many of the policies that Singapore started. And in the background, I think they work with other ASEAN member states, particularly on the economic front. DIPA is a good example. Digital Economy Partnership Agreement is something that's led by Singapore. It includes New Zealand, I think Korea, and one more country, right? So it's set. It's almost like we're concerned about the lack of movement in terms of e-commerce and digital trade. But you have economies like Singapore and others that would. Why don't we start first among like-minded partners? We come up with a great agreement, and others can come in. So leading by example is how I would describe the Singapore example, what Singapore can do. Any other questions, or would anyone want to answer? It doesn't have to be on Singapore, but on ASEAN. Anybody want to respond?
Okay. from my own experience of working within the ASEAN Secretariat, Singapore being small in size, but actually has been, I think, the most strategic country within ASEAN. And the fact that Singapore prosperity has been relying on its status as a global hub has been translated to its foreign policy advocacy within ASEAN. Basically, within ASEAN, Singapore focuses on two things. In strategic security domain, it is about keeping the region open and inclusive, with making sure that all the major powers have the platforms to be engaged, to be present in the region, so that there is no single hegemon could dominate the whole region. The second one, in economic terms, is more and more economic integration, more and more free trade agreements. The more trade that ASEAN does within itself, among them itself, but also with the world, the better for Singapore, because Singapore is the country with the highest trade to GDP in the region, or maybe in the world, more than 300%. So Singapore may be in a good position vis-a-vis Trump 2.0 in terms of the trade surplus, but I think Trump's approach to free trade is very hostile, and with all of these tariff hikes and the potential for trade contraction globally, then I think Singapore will also suffer a lot as well. But that is the view of a non-economist.
Yeah, I think there's some projects that we're doing in the school as well, looking at the role of small states and how they can also influence some of the superpowers in terms of areas on security, but I think that's for another seminar. Andy?
Could I just one final one, this time on sort of security relations. I was very interested to hear your thoughts there on that potential sort of grand bargain, the US and China, troop withdrawals, withdraw down from, say, Korean Peninsula, from Okinawa, from elsewhere, in return for something from China. And I wonder whether we'll see your views on whether we'll see more of a DMZ, demilitarized zone-ification of sort of South China Sea. And thinking about Korea, Trump said he's going to stop the war on day one, and the big fear for Zelensky and Europe and many others is that territory that Russia's taken will become a DMZ. Lebanon, southern Lebanon, is becoming a DMZ by Israel, so it's northern Gaza. I wonder whether we'd see something similar in the South China Sea, and what that would mean for the Philippines.
My prospects, the way I think about a potential grand bargain between the US and China involving the South China Sea, China would have to concede a lot. I don't know how much concessions China might be able to concede, and I don't think I'm not very worried about that grand bargain, because I don't think China will be able to meet what the United States and China will not be able to present a bargain good enough for Trump. I feel because I think what the United States wants from China economically is a lot of structural reforms that I don't think the Communist Party will be prepared to do. But I'm not so sure. I think keeping the South China Sea a little bit uncertain could help Trump make more economic deals with China rather than settling it now. If China settling it now for concessions that are not that major, I think from a game theory perspective, I don't think it makes sense for them to accept such a deal, and I don't think China would also ever consider such a deal. If I may pivot to the economic side, again, as a non-economist here on this table, there was a lot of discussion. There was a question earlier about how to manage chaos, right? Surely, no, there's going to be chaos coming into the Trump administration. But we also heard from Ha and from Hugh, from Dennis, that there are some structural factors behind Trump. So what explains Trump's protectionism in part is that Americans now support more protectionist policies. And what explains Americans' support for more protectionist policies is that globalization seemed to have not worked well as expected, and so there's a reverse globalization trend going on. So from a perspective of a political scientist, might we then question, if we don't want chaos too much in the world, might we then begin questioning, as many others did way before, what are the factors behind this reverse globalization? Have we shock therapied the global economy too much into way more economic integration agreements than otherwise? Is the solution to this reverse globalization more globalization? Did we just not do the first globalization right? Or perhaps, more inclusive policies, or perhaps, the Marxists were right that perhaps we need less globalization, and that there's some kind of magical thinking involved in having a state-centric international system, but at the same time having an integrated global economy. So just my thoughts on that. Perhaps if we do accept that the Trump phenomenon is a structural phenomenon, then maybe if we don't want chaos, the changes we need to be doing are structural. But I don't know what kind of structural changes at the global level should we be doing.
Yeah, I mean, from my experiences, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of buzzwords about inclusion, more inclusive policies, whether it's for economic or financial or social. But I don't see that being actually translated to actual, real, concrete policies, whether at different member states, and that's something maybe ASEAN needs to look at, because whether we like or not, the pandemic has really widened, even to some inadvertently widened, that inequality and that development divide in many member states. And that's something, whether it's within the state and also among different member states, that needs to be looked at. Any other questions out there? Yes, please. Yeah.
Adam from London School of Business and Finance. My question is about, in terms of political perspective, what will be the impacts of internal changes in the United States government? Because there have been talks mostly about the trade, economics, right? But there are also important aspects such as defense, healthcare, immigration, especially in the light of recent changes which Trump administration they're giving suggestions. For example, the recently established Department of Government Efficiency, which Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy is going to stand in, and there have been a lot of speculations around there. So what Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia or Philippines are prepared for the impacts in terms of these internal changes in the United States government?
It's a tough question. Anybody wants to handle that? What about Habib? You want to try? How do you handle that impact? Yeah.
How does Indonesia handle the impact? Actually, the answer is still unknown. But this is the point where, if we look back at during the first Trump presidency, one contentious issue for Indonesia was actually when Trump recognized Jerusalem as a part of Israel. And I guess that really caused concern from the Indonesian side. And again, because of that particular issue, so we tried to manage our own domestic situation, right? Protests about this issue, Israeli issue, and probably that was going to happen again during the second Trump presidency. We know Trump already appointed the U.S. ambassador to Israel, and also has had a call with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That one thing that Indonesia will anticipate about the Palestine and Israel issue. And then other than that, I guess that's the point where investing in relations with the Congress matters, because the Congress definitely represents the American people, right? So we need to understand, we need to strengthen through like the bilateral relationship between parliament to parliament. That's the way we try to manage with the consequences. But if I may, like going back to the ASEAN integration. As much as I'm optimistic about the ASEAN economic integration, I'm also cautious to the fact that we are still competing over the same pool of resources, competing over the same pool of influence, and also like to some extent market. Take a look on the example of 2023, like leaders' declaration on creating regional EV ecosystem when Indonesia was the chairman of ASEAN. But since then, I don't think there is any significant progress about how do we manage our own EV policies, fiscal incentives. I guess like we are racing to the bottom by providing like a lot of subsidies like to attract EV companies or EV manufacturers to our countries, and then there is not so much any progress about the setting EV standard at the regional level. So yes, I'm optimistic about this region and its potential, but also rational enough to also see like the reality on the ground. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
I'm not an America expert, and whatever we look at the US, we try to look at it from the Southeast Asian lens, how we will be impacted or whether we will benefit from it. So, so I try to answer your question in certain very fragmented dimensions. In terms of the streamlining of the bureaucracy of the US government, I think it is a very good move. If, I wish Elon Musk a lot of luck, and if he could succeed, I think Southeast Asian countries would benefit from it as well. Like, actually, there is one thing that the Vietnamese Communist Party new Secretary General has been talking about since he took office, is about cutting down on government expenses and bureaucracy and waste. So I think if we can learn something from the US, then that would be good as well. So we don't have to look at everything from a negative lens. Just now, Dennis mentioned the inclusiveness, diversity. That reminds me of the nominee by Trump for the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Actually, my concern is that he is busy fighting the work rather than fighting the enemies or the adversaries like China, and DEI, right? Diversity, equality, and inclusivity has become the new enemy of the incoming Secretary of Defense if he gets approved. So I think these kind of political movements in the US, like anti-immigration, anti-work, anti-establishment, anti-incumbency, would be felt more profoundly or be mirrored in countries like Europe rather than in Southeast Asia. And actually, we are Southeast Asian leaders and elites are quite comfortable with Trump's live and let live approach to domestic governance in other countries. So I don't think that would affect us that much. But one more point is that the progressive agenda under Trump administration on climate action, energy transition, gender empowerment, all of this will be rolled back, and that would potentially affect the U.S. Aid and development assistance globally as well, because the U.S., regardless of all of this rethinking of its engagement in the world, remains the largest donor of ODA actually in the world. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I just add about economic. I mean, okay, DEI is one thing, but there is economic inclusion is maybe I'm most comfortable is a serious problem. I mean, we know that income and wealth inequality has widened in many countries, including in Singapore. We also know that partly it's due to technology, and that's particularly in the US, right? Jobs are being lost and jobs are being displaced not because of free trade agreements. It's because many companies have been adopting different kinds of technologies, including robots, that have replaced many of the jobs which are routine in nature, right? So, and that's just going to cause that inequality to get worse, right? So I think that's why even in Singapore, if you talk about Singapore, Singapore is always worried about thinking ahead about these challenges, right? How are we going to reskill our workers who have been displaced because they're getting younger, right? I mean, I don't know. If you take a Grab, you'll notice that many of them have lost their jobs. Some of them are getting younger, and they could be displaced because of technology and other things. So the importance of how to reskill these workers so that they can move to other sectors is something that Singapore is already worried about, but other countries in ASEAN should be worried about too, right? It's not business as usual, as I said, right? People are getting displaced. Even in the Philippines, which has done so well in BPO call centers, but increasingly, when you pick up the phone, there's not going to be a human being on the other side when you got a problem with your phone or whatever. It's going to be a bot or something that's giving you very standard answers, which frustrates me. But that's what's happening, right? And so jobs are being changed, jobs are being displaced, and inequality is just going to get worse. So this is why there's a need to look at particularly economic inclusive policy. What do we need to do to support workers? What are the things that there are different ideas that's out there? I think you know that, right? From universal basic income to other things. You want to add something? Yeah.
On the government efficiency question, part of government efficiency, I suppose, is the personnel dimension. Not only how many personnel are going to get laid off, probably, but also the kind of personnel that are going to replace them. Part of the Project 2025, which Trump has said he will not implement, but if he does implement it after all, part of Project 2025 is to rid the American bureaucracy of career officials. So I wonder what that would make, I wonder about the implications of that to policy practitioners, policy professionals who are in the bureaucracy, who might get laid off because of those personnel changes that the Trump administration may do. And I'm not very worried about senior level posts. I'm worried about career level, middle level posts here. Part of why the Trump administration was not as chaotic as it could probably be was that Trump had still nonetheless a professional bureaucracy to help him implement his policies. No? There are some evidence to suggest that Trump would want a more chaotic policy, but the implementation was managed professionally. If you get rid of those policy professionals, what's going to happen with implementation now that you don't have that guardrail? That actually is what worries me, but Trump has said that he's not going to implement Project 2025, so I don't know, but I don't trust Trump, so let's see.
Somebody's been appointed, right, to implement it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But there's some, I think there's some positive news from the first Trump administration. The first Trump administration was very slow to make appointments. Trump now is making appointments even before they sit, right? But the first Trump administration made very, very late appointments, even in Asia appointments. No, we had a lot of vacant ambassadorships, vacant department assistant secretary positions. But still, even with those many vacancies on Asia profiles, Asia desks, Trump seemed to be able to implement the pivot to Asia better than Obama. So there's a silver lining there, I suppose. But let's wait and see what actually happens.
Thanks. I think we are running out of time. I know we have to close soon, but I think you've attended some of these seminars on the implications of the election. So I really hope that you got some interesting new insights from our speakers here. So please join me in thanking our speakers for an excellent presentation.